Hi, I'm Dr Mary-Ann and this is Inequality Bites.
This is poetry redefined, sagas from the left behind, novels of a different kind, need to make you state of mind. Look how masterminds are getting sent down for time. Take a look at our strengths all combined.
This is Inequality Bites, the podcast where we discuss how we can make society more equal so that everyone can flourish. In this series, we'll speak not only to experts on a range of different inequalities, but vitally also to those at the sharp end of inequality. Inequality Bites is created by the Equality Trust, the charity working to improve quality of life in the UK by reducing social and economic inequality, because more equal societies are better for us all. On the 29th of May 1970, women across the UK celebrated the passage of the Equal Pay Act, the legislation that outlawed pay discrimination on the basis of sex, and enshrined in law the duty of employers to award men and women equal pay for equal work or work of equal value. However, 50 years on, there are still an average of almost 29,000 equal pay claims brought forward each year, and women are paid roughly 83 pence for every £1 men earn. So today, we're going to be speaking about the thorny issue of gender pay discrimination with Dr Mary-Ann Stephenson, who's director of the UK Women's Budget Group. Mary-Ann has worked for women's equality and human rights for over 25 years as a campaigner, researcher and trainer. She was previously director of the Fawcett Society and a commissioner on the Women's National Commission. She's a founder member of Coventry Women's Voices and a board member at Coventry Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre and at Just Fair. So hi Mary-Ann, welcome to Inequality Bites and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on, Vonda.
I'd like you to share, if you would, with our listeners, just a little bit about your background and how and where you grew up.
I grew up all over the place. So I was born in Swansea in Wales. My parents moved to Greece when I was a baby. So I lived in Greece till I was 7. We then lived in Brentwood in Essex and then Guildford and then Oxfordshire. And then I went to Brighton for university, went to Sussex and then moved to London and then Nottingham. And now I'm in Kenilworth in Warwickshire. So I've moved around quite a bit.
So you must have seen a lot of different places, a lot of different experiences, but met a lot of different people and had to make those relationships as you moved. When did you first notice that gender inequality existed?
My mother is a feminist. There's a photograph of me aged 4 wearing a T-shirt with a picture of Lucy from Peanuts on saying, "I am a new feminist." I can't remember a time when I didn't know about feminism. I think I was kind of brought up being aware of inequality. But then there's things that kind of hit you over time, aren't there? Really, one of the big realizations actually happens when you have children. So, I'd worked in the women's movement. I'd been director of the Fawcett Society. I campaigned on equal pay. I campaigned against sex discrimination. But it wasn't until I had children and I saw the women around me having children that I really felt, in a really visceral sense, exactly what was happening to women in the labour market when they started caring. You can know something intellectually, but somehow think that you and the people you know will be exempt from it. Other things like, sexual harassment and sexual violence, you become aware of much earlier, I think. But that particular issue of particularly women being forced out of the labour market, women finding themselves paid less when they went back to work after maternity leave or being squeezed out after maternity leave and then not being able to get a job at the same level. That's when that really hit, I think.
Yeah, I remember when I was on maternity leave and a lot of my time was spent telling women about what their rights were and, hearing about the stories of, in particular, I remember some women in publishing who, from the day it was obvious that they were pregnant or they told people they were pregnant, they were just regarded as if, their time was limited and that was the end of their careers, of their jobs and that was the end of it. And I think it's really, really sad to see that. But I think what really struck me was also the lack of people's awareness of their employment rights and that employers were more than willing to take advantage of that. So I can really identify with that. What drives you to do the work that you do? Obviously, you were brought up as a feminist, and I think like many of us, you would credit your mother with that. What's a real drive apart from the work that you do on an intellectual level and the practical experience you've had?
Ultimately, it's about justice. It's about justice and the possibility of change. So it's feeling incredibly strongly that the way society is organised is unjust, but that also that's not a given. That's not something we just have to accept. It's not like the weather. It's something that we can do something about. One of the things about being involved in women's organisations for so long is you do see things change. You do see campaigns succeed. You see ideas that were seen as radical or extreme, some becoming accepted as kind of part of mainstream thinking. And that shows you that things can change. And I guess it's that possibility of change. If I didn't believe that things could be made better, I would probably give up and hide under the duvet.
I think we've all had moments like that, haven't we? Certainly, I know I have. And I think that's really important because I think we have, new generations of campaigners coming forward. And quite often they can be quite upset by the fact that we're looking at long-term change, that this isn't just going to happen with one petition or one action. So what advice would you give to younger campaigners, and how do you think we can all work together?
I think one of the key things is recognising that some things take a long time. And just because something is not going to be solved straight away doesn't mean that you shouldn't fight for it. And that quite often you can have a victory and then things can go back. You need to keep watching and you need to keep vigilant. The other thing is about forming alliances and partnerships and recognising that nobody can do this on their own. We need to work together. We need to find people with whom we have common ground and form alliances to be stronger. And on an individual basis, to take breaks, to not burn yourself out. It can be disheartening and dispiriting and sometimes scary, particularly with social media these days. It can be quite an unpleasant and difficult place, particularly for young women, particularly women of colour. The kind of level of vitriol and sexism that they experience is horrific. And so you need to take breaks. You need to be able to say, actually, I'm going to step back for a bit. I can't do all of this. And be kind to yourself and be kind to other people and recognise we're all doing our best.
And I think that's sometimes something that we really forget, don't we, when we're trying to fight so hard to change things, that to actually take care of ourselves is often at the bottom of the list of things to do. And I really like the intersectional approach that the Women's Budget Group has taken. And I often, refer to your work with the Runnymede Trust, for example, in talks that I give, because I think part of the problem is that we are working in silos, aren't we? And we're not really doing as much of that alliance building as we really should do. So do you have any personal experience of any unequal pay, or have you seen it happen to your friends and family?
I've certainly seen unequal pay happen to friends and family. I've seen friends who discovered that they were being paid significantly less than the men actually sat next to them. I've seen women come in to do jobs and discover that they were paid less than the man who was doing the job before them. Me personally, I haven't, but I've been fortunate. I've either worked in organisations that have very transparent pay structures. You're on a scale, you start on that point on the scale and that's it. Or I've worked in the women's voluntary sector. So generally speaking, there aren't very many men working there to compare yourself to. But, I have seen the kind of shock that women experience when they realise that actually they're being paid less than their male colleagues. And sometimes being told that they were really lucky to get the pay rate that they did, and that the employer wouldn't normally do this, but they're doing this because these particular women were so brilliant. And then they discover that they're earning, sometimes £10,000-20,000 a year less than a man who was previously doing the job. And it just baffles me why employers think that's an acceptable way to behave.
So today we're going to be talking about pay discrimination, because 50 years on from the passage of the Equal Pay Act, women are still experiencing unequal pay. Mary-Ann, what do you think is the true scale of the problem?
I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's so many different ways of looking at the numbers here. There's a difference between unequal pay and the gender pay gap. So unequal pay is where you are being paid less than somebody doing the same job or a job of equal value. We don't necessarily know the scale of that, because you could look at the number of cases that go to employment tribunal, but most people don't take their employer to an employment tribunal, and many, many people don't realise that they are not being paid equally. And then you've got the gender pay gap, where, again, we have different numbers that are being used. So, I mean, you were talking about at the beginning about the overall gender pay gap, which is about 17%, and that's, all women and all men in employment. Quite often the figure of women and men working full-time is quoted, which is about 9%. But obviously, a really high proportion of women in paid work part-time. So excluding part-time workers seems a slightly odd way of calculating it. And then you've got the gender earnings gap, which is actually about how much women earn compared to how much men earn over the course of a year. And the gap there is 43%. So if you're talking about women's lives and ability to pay rent and pay bills and buy food and look after your kids, the key thing is actually the earnings gap. And that is huge. And that's obviously a combination of the gender pay gap, but also the fact that women are more likely to work part-time because they're more likely to do more caring work than men do.
I think that's quite stunning, isn't it, thinking about the earnings gap? And it makes me think about the wealth gap that must be out there between men and women, which must be absolutely huge when we consider access to assets and wealth. So, as you say, there are many, many different ways of looking at it. And I think sometimes we do take the most simplistic way. We know that coronavirus has hugely impacted on women's economic standing. And the Women's Budget Group has been running the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy and recently released a final report. What were the key issues that emerged from that report?
Well, the report started before the pandemic. You know, we started at a point where we thought we would be coming up with a set of proposals that were trying to make a kind of radical change in a situation where we were dealing with Brexit. That's what, you know, that's the framework we thought about. And clearly the pandemic has changed things and in many ways made things very much worse. One of the things we wanted to do with the report was look across the economy as a whole. So we looked at issues around trade, around fiscal policy, around, you know, whether gross domestic product, GDP, is the right measure for the success of an economy, or whether you should look at issues like well-being or equality. When it came to employment and pay, I think the key finding of the Commission was the link between women's position in the paid labour market and women's position in the unpaid world of work in the home, particularly care work. So women earn less and own less because they do more care work, 60% more unpaid work than men, most of which is care work. And that means they have less time for paid work, less time for networking, less time for training sometimes, particularly if it's not provided by the employer, which means that they earn less and own less and are more likely to be poor. One of the key things we were calling for was a caring economy, an economy that centred care, both paid and unpaid. And in terms of the current pandemic, a care-led recovery from the pandemic. One of the research papers that was produced for the Commission showed that if you invested in the care sector, you could create 2.7 times as many jobs as the same amount of money invested in construction. We are going to be facing really high levels of unemployment in the next year or so. The government strategy, which is kind of build, 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 will create fewer jobs than a strategy that was care, care, care. And also those jobs don't necessarily benefit the places where they're needed most. So if you think about a construction project, you can end up with workers on a construction site coming from all over the country. You know, big construction companies will ship workers in. You don't necessarily keep the money in the local economy, whereas if you're thinking about care workers, whether in a care home or going into other people's home, they tend to work in their local community, they spend money in their local community. So the government's levelling up agenda would be much better fulfilled by a focus on care.
So you found that link between really women's work and the money staying in the economy and staying in the local area, which I think is really, really important. Were there any other aspects of the report that you feel, you know, government really should be taking notice of?
There's a whole set of issues around tax and the social security system. We have a tax system which deliberately advantages those people who have unearned income from wealth. So the rate of tax on income from wealth is far lower than the rate of tax on earnings. So your care worker will be paying more tax per pound than somebody whose income comes from dividends, from stocks and shares, for example. And that clearly can't be right. We have a social security system which is pushing far too many people into poverty. And we've seen with the coronavirus how threadbare our social security system is, how inadequate it is to meet the needs of the population. You know, it's one of the least generous social security systems in Europe. And then there's the kind of wider point about what is the economy for? So often when we think about the economy, when people study economics at school or university, it's all about supply and demand and price points. It's not actually about people's lives. It's not about what is important in our lives, what we want to see happen in our communities and in our societies. And so much of what happens in the economy is completely invisible. I don't know if you've read the book Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, but it's absolutely brilliant. And this, it really sums up this problem. So you've got Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nations, and he's talking about the profit motive, and he's talking about, it's not from people's own generosity that I get my dinner. It's the profits that it gives to the butcher or the baker. And he's sat there writing his book. Who is bringing him his dinner every night? His mother. His mother lived with him, and his mother cooked him dinner every night. And she did not do that because of the profit motive. She did it because she was his mum. And that's what mums do. And he was writing about the economy and about how he got his dinner, and he completely discounted the unpaid labour of the women in his own household. And that's the way kind of classical economics thinks of unpaid work. It's not part of the real economy. So we need to fundamentally rethink the way we approach the economy, to recognise both the kind of unpaid work, the human impact of the economy, but also the kind of wider environmental impact, the sort of environmental externalities. Anything that's not proper economic is an externality. And that's why I think, the ideas of donut economics are so exciting, because it's about saying, actually, let's think about what do we really need to think about when we think about the economy. It's not just this little bit of goods and services bought and sold in the market. It's actually about people, and it's about our planet. And that's the approach to the economy we need to have.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's very rare these days that I'm on panels with people who are talking about supply and demand, but it happened to me last year where, I was sitting with an economist who was talking about the rationale of decisions. And I said, well, I don't know about anyone in the audience here, but I cannot guarantee you that I've made rational decisions since I was a baby, and that all of my choices have been informed by a rational thought. Because, the first thing that strikes you when you look at that type of teaching of economics is that it just doesn't work. We are not widgets. We don't make decisions in that way. There are all sorts of other influences. So for me, it's always, coming to it later in life, it's always seemed absolutely flawed, because there is no personality within those ways of thinking. So I think you're right. And the accumulation, what we see in society is it's all about accumulation, getting more and more, whether it's wealth or assets or houses or cars, and going up and up the ladder for what? When you look back down, what are you looking at? And that is a very old way of thinking.
There is a point below which an increase in your wealth and standard of living will make you happier. If you're in a situation where you don't have enough to meet your basic needs, clearly it is important to improve your income. But above a certain level, it doesn't actually make any difference. And it's very interesting. A friend of mine, she's a tax lawyer, and she was saying, when you look at really high earning people, the thing about the money is it's actually just an indicator of success. The money itself doesn't matter. You could almost give them gold stars. It's about your status compared to your peers. And so what's really important is not how much money you've got because you want to spend it on these particular things or you want to do these great things with it. It's about, have I got more gold stars than the boy on the next desk? And so, maybe we need to find another way of showing people who need to feel really big and important that they are really big and important without necessarily having to pay them astronomically high salaries.
Well, we'll be taking answers on a postcard, please, to that one, if you can come up with a better idea than gold stars, although I'm quite partial to a gold star myself. So we're coming back to this idea of how we value people and how we value people's contribution in the labour market. I mean, it really is our exchange of labour and what we can get for it. But the labour market is heavily gendered. And why do we still value the work of women, disabled people, Black and Asian people, and LGBTQ plus people as worth less?
I think you have to kind of unpick different groups, because I think there's undervaluing for different groups for different reasons. There is, for example, both racism and sexism, but they have different roots and they take different forms. So when it comes to women, Often the work that women do is undervalued because it closely mirrors the work that women do for nothing in the home. So, care, cleaning, cooking, and so on. Those jobs are particularly badly paid because the skills involved with them are not recognised. People don't see them as particularly skilled work. With race, there's a combination of factors. There's the fact that historically large numbers of people were brought to the UK as migrants to do jobs that the white British population didn't want to do. And they were the least well paid and the least pleasant jobs to do. And because those were the jobs that those communities started off in, there's a kind of assumption about the kind of skill level. And there's also a whole set of racist assumptions about intelligence and ability, which play through in our education system, so have a knock-on effect on people's educational outcomes. With disability, very often it's about a society which, A, sees the impairment and not the person, and B, isn't prepared to make the reasonable adjustments necessary for people to be able to enter certain jobs in the first place. There's a really high level of underemployment of disabled people because employers won't make the kind of adjustments necessary. So you've got that mixture of discrimination, of assumptions about skill levels in particular jobs, about failure to make reasonable adjustments, and they all kind of come together and coalesce to lead to pay gaps.
Thanks for listening to Inequality Bites. If you're enjoying today's podcast, would you consider donating the cost of a cup of coffee or lunch to the Equality Trust? This will help us to support young people to speak truth to power, to campaign on key issues like fair and equal pay, and to produce more online content like this podcast to raise awareness of the damage that inequality causes and how we can reduce this, because inequality is not inevitable. We understand that not everyone can donate, so if you can't, then please visit our website to sign up to our mailing list, take action on our latest campaigns, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of the podcast. So thinking about the gender pay gap reporting and the regulations were suspended earlier in the year, are you concerned that there's a danger that they won't be reinstated?
Very much so, yes, for a number of reasons. First of all, this is not, I don't think, a passion project of our current Prime Minister. It's not something that I think he cares particularly deeply about. There will be pressures from business and others to remove what they would describe as red tape, both because of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, but also the impact of Brexit. We're heading into a kind of double recession, coronavirus recession and a Brexit recession. And in those circumstances, there will be pressure to say, actually, we need to cut back not just on things like gender pay gap reporting, but also on pre-existing workplace rights. We know that there's members of government who would quite happily get rid of some of the protections against maternity discrimination, for example. And I think there is a real risk that in a situation where the economy is doing badly, that's presented as kind of an unnecessary bit of red tape that's holding business back, rather than what it is, a way of ensuring, first of all, justice, but secondly, that actually businesses are able to take full advantage of the talent of the whole population, rather than ultimately driving women out. What do you think needs to change in terms of law or policy or company practices? And have you seen anything that's worked well elsewhere? Well, a few weeks ago, Stella Creasy introduced a bill into Parliament sponsored by the Fawcett Society, which was about addressing the kind of causes of the gender pay gap, which sets out a whole series of recommendations that we would support around the right to know what your colleagues are being paid, the right to request information so that you can see whether you're not being paid equally, end to time limits for tribunals and so on. That would make a real difference. I think the other thing is for employers to actually take the pay gap seriously. So one of the things we first saw when pay gap reporting was introduced was employers saying things like, oh, yeah, well, we have a pay gap, but that's just because we don't have any women at senior levels. Like, that's the end of the story. And it's like, well, why don't you have women at senior levels? What are you going to do about that? Or we do have a pay gap, but that's just because women tend to be in less well-paid sectors of our organisation. So, why are you paying the jobs that men do more than you're paying the jobs that women do? those sorts of challenges to employers to actually review their pay legislation, to be transparent. One of the things that makes the biggest difference is actually having transparent pay scales. So everybody knows what everybody else gets paid. That's fairly standard in large parts of the public sector. But in parts of the private sector, that's just looked on in horror, because there is this sort of assumption that you need to be able to negotiate salaries with people on an individual basis, when we know that disadvantages women, it disadvantages people of colour, it disadvantages disabled people. And that's not because of a failure to negotiate. We also know that if women negotiate for a pay rise, they're judged more harshly by their employers than men are. So you're in a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Whereas actually having transparent pay scales that are properly negotiated, so you compare the salaries across the board at different levels, makes it much, much harder to hide unequal pay. And I also think we need to introduce ethnicity pay gap reporting. We know that the ethnicity pay gap is significant. And for women of Bangladeshi and Pakistani origin, for example, the gender pay gap, or the difference between their pay and the pay of white men, is over 25%. So we need to be collecting that data in order to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We did a report into the FTSE 100 in terms of gender pay and gender bonus gaps and CEO pay gaps. And the differences between different parts of the companies was really quite astonishing. And in some companies, you basically had retail separated out from warehousing, and therefore, you eliminate the pay gap there because you've got a very gender segregated workforce there. If you could do one thing to make the economy work better for women, what would you do?
Recognise the significance of unpaid care. The gender distribution of unpaid labour, particularly unpaid care, is at the heart of the inequality that women face in the labour market. Even women who don't have children suffer because of the unpaid care that other women do, because employers assume that either they will be doing unpaid care or that they should be doing unpaid care, that there's something wrong with them, that they're not proper women because they're not mothers. If we want to tackle inequality in the public part of the economy, we need to tackle inequality in the home. When we analysed the causes of the gendered inequalities that women face, unpaid care was at the heart of them. There are other inequalities that women face. Women can face inequalities because of race or because of class, but the bits that are to do with gender as a structure of inequality are largely rooted in either in unpaid care or in violence.
At this point in the podcast, we like to ask our guest for one thing listeners can do today, this week, and this year to stand up against pay discrimination.
I think at the moment there is the bill that Stella Creasy introduced into Parliament, and it's really important to raise those issues with your MP and to write to your MP and to say that you want to see those changes happen, to put pressure on the government not to roll back on the gender pay gap reporting and to introduce reporting on the ethnicity pay gap. Actually showing MPs and the government that this is something people care about is a really important thing. I think longer term, being part of greater transparency about pay. So, if you're part of a union, get involved in the union so that you can push your employer, if they're not transparent about pay scales, to actually introduce a transparent pay scale. Much the fairest way to deal with this. If you're not part of a union, join a union. If you run an organisation that's not unionised, inform your staff that you'd be very happy to recognise a union and suggest that they join one. What you can do depends on the situation you're in, I guess. But, whether it's challenging unequal pay you yourself are facing, so actually talk to your colleagues about how much they're earning. If you're a man, tell your female colleagues how much you're earning and ask them how much they're earning and see if there's a difference. A lot of equal pay cases only happen because women find out by accident that they were unfairly paid. So the more we talk about it, we have a very kind of British idea that talking about how much you earn is somehow a little bit vulgar. And actually, it's not. It's essential. We need to know. Talk about it. Normalise talking about it. We should all know how much people earn. And then it wouldn't be possible to have kind of hidden pay discrimination.
That's great. Lots of suggestions there from Mary-Ann. And at the Equality Trust, we would urge you to check out Equal Pay Month in November and our actions then and get involved and sign up to our newsletter on our website. Mary-Ann, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Inequality Bites, the podcast exploring not just the damage that inequality is causing, but also the solutions, so that we can create a more equal society that's better for everyone. Our next episode is the first of our Everyday Inequality episodes, where we hear from someone who's experienced the very issue we've just discussed. Sophia Moreau will be on the podcast discussing her experience of finding out that she was being paid less than a white male co-worker, and speaking more broadly about the issues facing women in the workplace in 2020.
It in a way set the tone. It sounds quite dark when I say that, but having had that experience prepared me for future events. But it did show me that no matter what objective evidence I brought to them, like the job spec, like my experiences, like his experience, like what he was being paid and what I was being paid, it didn't really affect the consequence or the outcome, which was quite like a disempowering feeling, because I always thought that if you're equipped with your knowledge of your rights and such, and you show them where they've gone wrong, then they'll try and put it right because it's not a good reflection on them and it's probably not their intention. But of course, that wasn't really the case.
Let us know what you thought on Twitter. Subscribe, like and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Acast, or whatever platform you're listening on, and tell your friends. See you next time for Inequality Bites.